Joined by John Eastman's attorney, Charles Burnham. He is representing multiple clients in special counsel Jack Smith's investigation, but we are focusing on Eastman tonight. And I very much appreciate your time, Charles. So let me just start to try to understand where exactly your client stands. Obviously, he's labeled co-conspirator number 2 in the indictment. Just to be clear, has your client, John Eastman, been indicted at this time?
No. Well, thank you very much for having me on. And absolutely no, John Eastman has not been indicted on this time, and we very much think he should not be.
So have you been in touch with the special counsel's office since the indictment was revealed yesterday?
We have not.
Okay. Now, is there any chance that your client would cooperate with the special counsel, Jack Smith?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by cooperate. Dr. Eastman is happy to tell his side of the story, to talk about the issues he believes are important to the Constitution and the country. And under the right circumstances, certainly he would share those views and share his recollections of everything that happened in 2020 with the special counsel. But if by cooperation you mean flipping on Donald Trump or providing incriminating information, then absolutely not, simply because those aren't the facts of this case as it pertains to Dr. Eastman.
And I want to get to those in a moment. Well, you say under the right circumstances, but you don't describe it as flipping. What are the right circumstances? Would that be immunity from prosecution or from indictment? Or, I mean, obviously he's in this indictment listed as a co-conspirator, so people anticipate that there likely will be an indictment. So I'm just trying to understand, what does under the right circumstances mean?
Well, I think if we thought there was an opportunity to engage with special counsel in a manner that we could be assured that they had an open mind about the truth, and we could attempt to explain some of the circumstances that might have led them to name him as an unindicted co-conspirator, because we do believe there are some serious misunderstandings. If you read the indictment, there's much I could talk about that. And under the right circumstances, we'd be happy to have that dialogue with Mr. Smith or with his assistant. Certainly we would.
Okay, all right, but if I am trying to understand what you're saying, to that there would be some sort of immunity involved with you, you're talking about the misunderstandings as you see them in here, that would be fair.
Certainly, I mean, immunity would be great. We'd be happy to receive it, but I'm not sitting here saying we would insist on that.
So you'd do it for less than immunity?
Oh, certainly.
Like what?
Because Dr. Eastman has nothing to hide in the situation. He's been very open about his role. He's made numerous TV appearances. He's written articles on it. He's been very much an open book, as his attorneys have to a certain extent, about his activities in 2020. He has nothing to hide. He committed no crimes. And as I said, under the right circumstances, we look forward to having that dialogue with the special counsel.
So let me get to the heart of this then, because what I just played, and I know you heard him a moment ago, Mr. Lauro, Trump's current lawyer, speaking this morning, his defense, the former president's defense, is to say that your client told him what to do and he just did it. He said, and I quote him this morning, there you saw him with Savannah, "You had one of the leading constitutional scholars in the United States, John Eastman, say to President Trump, 'This is a protocol that you can follow. It's legal.' That eliminates criminal intent." So he's blaming your client, not his. Is Trump throwing Eastman under the bus?
Absolutely not, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about that. And I respectfully disagree with the phrasing that he's blaming our client. In fact, I have absolutely no qualm with any of the statements from Mr. Lauro on your show, and he's made a couple other statements to that effect. Dr. Eastman was President Trump's attorney, and Mr. Trump did have a right to rely on his advice. Dr. Eastman stands by that advice, and he'd give largely the same advice, I think, if the situation repeated itself today. And that's really is the heart of this case. I agree with you. Dr. Eastman is now looking at possibly the threat of indictment for acting as an attorney, making arguments on behalf of his client. Prosecuting attorneys for doing that, which is their jobs, I submit, would be a very troubling prospect if the special counsel indeed takes that step, which is
okay. So you dispute that Trump's lawyer saying that his counsel told him to do this and therefore it's fine, it's not Trump's problem. That is not throwing Trump under the bus.
I don't think it's throwing John Eastman under the bus. I don't interpret it that way at all.
I'm sorry, throwing John Eastman under the bus. I misspoke, yeah.
That's correct. I don't interpret it as throwing him under the bus at all. I have no problem with Mr. Lauro's statements at all.
Okay. All right, so let me understand why then, because what the indictment alleges that your client did, of course, in terms of the advice, crucial advice, they lay out meetings, they talk about who was in these meetings early in January, before January 6th, January 4th, and January 5th. Eastman, your client, meets with the president, the vice president, and the defendant, Trump and Eastman, asked the vice president to either unilaterally reject the legitimate electors from the 7 targeted states or send the question of which elector slate was legitimate to the state legislatures. So they say that happened. The next day, they say it happened again on the morning of January 5th at Trump's direction. There's this meeting with Eastman. Eastman advocates that the vice president do what the defendant had said he preferred the day before, unilaterally reject electors from the targeted states. This is the heart of the matter. That Trump is saying that your client told Pence to go ahead and do it. Reject the electors from the states. It's fine. There's no problem with it. Did that not happen?
Well, I would add a little bit of nuance there. Dr. Eastman is on record several times stating that his recommended course of action was not to unilaterally reject the electors peremptorily on January 6th. His recommendation, this was repeated by President Trump in his remarks at the ellipse, was simply to send the matter back to the states, many of the legislatures of which had yet to complete their investigations of the various allegations that were out there, for them to do whatever investigation they saw fit pursuant to their power as state legislatures, and then report back to Vice President Pence and the Electoral College on whatever their findings were. And Dr. Eastman's longer memo, which has been in the public domain for a long time, spells out several situations, 3 or 4 situations in which this process might have resulted in affirming now President Biden's victory. So it wasn't simply a scheme to keep President Trump in power by whatever means necessary. Everybody involved knew that this process could result in nothing other than Biden and Vice President Harris being inaugurated as they were. I think that's important.
So there's a further point, though, then that happens in this indictment. It says on January 4th that your client, John Eastman, met with the president and vice president, right, and then asked Pence to unilaterally reject or send the slates back to legislatures, as you and I are talking about. The indictment then goes on to say, Charles, on that same day, when Eastman acknowledged to the defendant's senior advisor that no court would support his proposal, the senior advisor told Eastman, "You're going to cause riots in the streets." Eastman responded that there had previously been points in the nation's history where violence was necessary to protect the republic. Now, on this point, Charles, the takeaway here, of course, is not veiled. The line says that your client felt that this was a point in history where violence could be justified to protect the republic. Is that accurate? Does he stand by that?
No, absolutely not. And I have 2 points to make about that. The first is those allegations, being familiar with the investigation of this case, are drawn from the one-sided recounting of that conversation from Mr. Jacob as the individual referred to there. So I would just ask your viewers to...
advisor.
That's right, to Chief Counsel of the Vice President Pence. So I would just ask your viewers to imagine if they were ever involved in a contentious argument, how they would feel if the substance of that argument were to be communicated to the world solely by their adversary, right? I'm not accusing Mr. Jacob of anything, but that's just his version of what happened, right? And there's significant nuance there. Dr. Eastman never called for violence or anything close to that. It was simply a discussion of what would likely happen if some of the issues that the 2 gentlemen were debating were to make their way through the courts. And there's much more we would add to the highly selective presentation of that conversation included in the indictment. That's a common problem that we've seen in this indictment, that there's a quote here, a quote there, and the full context isn't there. And of course, Jack Smith doesn't have to put the defense case in his indictment. There's no obligation for him to do that. But I think it's important for everybody to understand that when you see these 3- and 4-word quotes in the indictment, there's more that will eventually be added to that story. And the conversation with Mr. Jacobs is a perfect example of that.
All right. So just to understand, though, you're just saying context is missing. You're not saying he didn't say what's in here.
I'm not conceding the quote that at all, that some aspects of Mr. Jacobs' characterizations are accurate, or at least roughly accurate. Some are not, and anything involving calling for violence we would dispute, certainly. And that's completely inconsistent with everything else the world knows about Dr. John Eastman. That's
and I do, and obviously he has been world-renowned nationally renowned constitutional scholar, which is why he is at the heart of this. Let me just ask one other thing, though, to understand, because there are some very specific allegations in here. We've just talked about a couple of them. There are others.
Sure.
When Jack Smith lays out accusations involving your client in terms of organizing the fraudulent slates of electors. Just in Arizona, he says the Arizona House Speaker explained that state investigators had uncovered no evidence of substantial fraud in the state. Eastman concedes that he didn't know enough about facts on the ground in Arizona, but nonetheless told the Arizona House Speaker to decertify and let the courts sort it out. The Arizona House Speaker refused, stating that he would not play with the oath he had taken to uphold the United States Constitution and Arizona law. The Arizona House Speaker, Charles, of course, is Rusty Bowers. Did your client tell him to decertify the results and let the courts sort it out?
No, not in those terms or anywhere close to that. And I think that's an important point, is Dr. Eastman's role in this is he was not a forensic investigator. He wasn't there, examining the machines or going through the ballots. He was the constitutional scholar. So his main role with respect to state legislatures in particular, as you mentioned, was to educate state legislators on their constitutional power in elections, which many of them, just through no fault of their own, just certainly weren't familiar with. So with respect to Arizona and other states, Georgia, Dr. Eastman educated the legislatures on what the Constitution said about their power in elections, and it was largely up to them to look at the investigations, consider the evidence, and decide if there was any basis to exercise that authority. And the important thing to remember is before any state legislature could take any action with respect to the election, a majority of that body, these are representatives elected by the people,
right,
accomplished individuals, would have to vote in favor of that. If Dr. Eastman or whoever else was making similar arguments couldn't convince a majority of the state legislature that they had the power and grounds existed to use it, then nothing would happen, as ultimately nothing did happen.
All right, well, Charles, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.